Thank you, Assemblymember, for taking the time today to meet with us. We've come today to speak with you about a bill that we support very strongly and are seeking your support for, and that is SB 308, the Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act, which has been introduced by Senator Josh Becker. This legislation concerns carbon dioxide removal, or CDR. Carbon dioxide removal is what it sounds like, and these are processes that take carbon that's already in the air out of the air and then put it somewhere where it's going to safely and durably stay for a long period of time. And it's very important up front to make very clear that this is not the same as carbon capture. Carbon removal and carbon capture are different things. Again, carbon removal is when you take carbon out of the air that's already in the air. Carbon capture is when you stop carbon from going up into the air from point sources and then you store it. These are different things that you pursue for different reasons. Why is carbon removal important, and why do policy makers need to think about it, and why does California need to act on it? And this really comes from the science. At this point, it's settled. The IPCC has made very clear in the last several assessment reports is that we now need to do carbon removal in addition to carbon reduction and resilience to balance very difficult to solve sectors and to remove legacy emissions that are already causing problems for our climate. And it's not just the IPCC that is now acknowledging this. In states and countries all over the world, carbon removal is now being considered from a policy lens, and that includes here in California. In fact, in California, the CARB scoping plan from 2022 was very explicit that carbon removal, this is a quote from it, and sequestration are essential to the state's objective to meet net zero or carbon neutrality. And they've done and published the math is that there's no chance of the state reaching carbon neutrality by 2045 under current law without carbon removal and sequestration. And in the scoping plan, they even published very specific numbers, and they estimated that the state will need to remove per year by 2030 7 million metric tons of carbon and store it. And then that ramps up over time. And by 2045, it's 75 million metric tons of removal per year to reach carbon neutrality. And this amount actually closely corresponds to the gap that is already in our existing net zero law here in California, which required that 85% of the net zero target would be reached through emissions reduction, leaving a 15% gap. And that's where carbon removal would come in. And very importantly, while they acknowledge that scaling carbon removal in California has to happen in the coming years and decades, we can't get there overnight. So it's absolutely critical that we start making investments and requirements for carbon removal right now and then scale them up over time. And fortunately, California is blessed with so many resources, human and natural, where we can do almost every form of carbon removal here within our borders. And that's a very important point to emphasize about carbon removal. It's not just one or two things that many people might associate with it. Yes, there's natural solutions like afforestation and soil carbon, and there's high-tech solutions like direct air capture, which we have already deployed here in California. But there's dozens of other types of pathways that involve using nature and engineering both on land and at sea. And this list or spectrum keeps expanding all the time. But a state like California doesn't want to just pick a particular form of carbon removal to support. It wants to think through what is the most effective way to do carbon removal in the state. And that consists of many different factors that need to be considered. We need to have safe carbon removal, make sure that there's no harm that's produced for communities or the population at large or ecosystems. We should select for forms of carbon removal that have co-benefits or are co-beneficial. So in addition to removing carbon, do they produce jobs? Do they help increase the performance of agriculture? Do they have other impacts that can be measured that are beneficial and worth doing in addition to carbon removal? And very, very important, can they be verified? Is the science and the technology at a place where we can actually be sure that the removal and the storage is happening? So verifiability is really important. And obviously affordability. We need to ultimately pick solutions that are economic, but that means also looking at solutions that might be expensive today, but as they scale, like solar, wind, and electric vehicles, they will become cheaper. So we need to consider present day costs and future possible costs when we think of affordability. And then finally, are they durable? Meaning when you take the carbon out of the air and you put it somewhere, do we know that it's not going to leak out or is it's going to stay there? And is it long lasting? Are we talking decades, centuries, or millennia? And obviously the more long lasting solutions are more favorable. And I should also note that California, in addition to the potential to do many forms of carbon removal because of our natural resources, We already have the world's largest concentration of carbon dioxide removal startups, investors, and buyers. California is already the world capital of carbon removal in terms of industry formation. It's also home to many leading research centers, both at universities and labs. And that makes carbon removal not only significant as a climate solution, but as a future industry. And estimates from a number of sources, including McKinsey, but they're not alone, consistently estimate that this is a future $1 trillion industry by 2050. And California is very well positioned, like we've done with many technologies in the past, to be a global leader and to capture benefits and advantages from that economically. And this is where SB 308 comes in and why we're meeting with you today, because it's a piece of legislation that will start to activate our carbon removal potential here in California so that we can reach our net zero goals and we can build a world leading carbon dioxide removal industry here within California. And what SB 308 proposes is for us to look at our own net zero targets, where we already acknowledge that 85% of that will come from emissions reductions, and to take that additional 15% and make sure we're in a position to close it with carbon dioxide removal as CARB's scoping plan clearly lays out and quantifies. As law, SB 308 would create a schedule that lines up with our own net zero schedule between now and 2045, and it requires the state to support or commit to carbon dioxide removal that would scale up over time to close that gap. Those requirements would start off very, very small in 2028 and then scale up over time by 2045 to fill the net zero gap, while also creating demand for many carbon dioxide removal companies and solution providers that already call California home. There are many other details about the bill, which we're happy to discuss with you, but that is the core of it. And we're very, very pleased that over the last several months, since the bill was introduced last year, in fact, we have put together a diverse coalition of supporters ranging from many top local and national environmental advocacy groups, as well as carbon dioxide removal suppliers and investors and other types of civil society orgs. So thank you for your time. And with that, we'll take your question.